In 1942, as German bombers thundered across Europe and the Reich seemed unshakable, a strange idea took root inside the mind of Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda. While cities were reduced to rubble and soldiers froze on the Eastern Front, Goebbels wanted to produce a film that would capture the grandeur of Nazi Germany and remind the world of its supposed moral superiority. He believed cinema was not only a weapon of persuasion but also a mirror of power, and no story could serve that purpose better than the Titanic. The tragedy of the great British liner, which sank in 1912, had become a universal symbol of human arrogance and failure. To Goebbels, it was the perfect parable to expose what he called the corruption of capitalism and the greed of Britain's elite. The propaganda ministry assembled a massive production team under the state-controlled UFA Studios, the crown jewel of German cinema. The budget was extravagant for wartime conditions. Steel, lumber, and skilled labor were diverted from the front lines to the movie set. In a nation where ordinary people were rationed to the bone, this project received priority treatment. It was conceived as a cinematic weapon, a psychological strike against the Allies. The Titanic film would depict British industrialists forcing the ship to sail at reckless speed to secure financial gain, ignoring the warnings of a virtuous German officer who foresaw disaster. The lesson was meant to be clear. The British world order, driven by profit and pride, would sink under its own greed, while the German spirit would stand noble and pure. As the cameras rolled, Goebbels demanded that every scene embody ideological precision. He approved the script line by line, ensuring that moral blame fell squarely on British shoulders. In the story, the White Star Line's obsession with prestige mirrors what the Nazis considered the decadence of Western democracy. The Titanic's voyage became an allegory of the British Empire itself, steaming toward collapse. Behind the scenes, however, the production was chaotic. Director Herbert Salepin was known for his perfectionism and short temper. He pushed his actors beyond exhaustion and refused to compromise with military officers assigned to advise the film. Salepin openly criticized them, calling them arrogant and incompetent, a dangerous move in Hitler's Germany. His honesty would cost him his life. The filming itself was monumental. Massive sets were built inside the Tempelhof studios, recreating the Titanic's grand staircase, dining salons, and lifeboat decks with astonishing accuracy. For the open-sea sequences, the production used an actual passenger liner, the SS Cap Arcona, which was docked in the Baltic. Extras included hundreds of sailors and soldiers who were ordered to appear as passengers and crew. Many of them would later serve on real battlefronts, never realizing that this film would outlive them as a symbol of a doomed regime. The conditions on set mirrored the war outside. Air raids often forced production to halt, and rumors spread that the Allies might bomb the studios. Still, Goebbels insisted the film continue. To him, propaganda was war, and every frame of film was ammunition. Salepin's clashes with authority grew louder as the project neared completion. He accused naval officers of incompetence and mocked the regime's interference in artistic matters. Within days, he was arrested by the Gestapo. According to official reports, he hanged himself in his cell, but many in the studio believed he had been murdered to silence dissent. When news of his death reached the crew, shock spread through the production. Yet Goebbels showed no sympathy. He replaced Salepin, finished the film under strict supervision, and prepared it for release. By the time the Nazi Titanic premiered in 1943, Germany was suffering devastating defeats in Russia and Africa. Instead of inspiring pride, the film's tone of catastrophe struck too close to home. Crowds watching the ship sink on screen could not ignore the parallels with their own collapsing nation. Goebbels, fearing the film would demoralize the public, ordered it banned shortly after its release. Only a few private screenings were allowed for selected audiences. The propaganda masterpiece had become a liability. It was too tragic, too honest, and far too revealing of the truth that Goebbels himself could no longer control. In the wreck of his own cinematic creation, he saw a reflection of the Reich's inevitable downfall. The irony was haunting. The film meant to mock British arrogance ended up mirroring the fate of Nazi Germany, a power convinced of its invincibility, blind to its own destruction. The obsession with the Titanic had begun as an attempt to rewrite history, to turn a maritime tragedy into a political sermon. But like the ship it portrayed, the project was doomed by arrogance and delusion. Millions of marks were spent to produce a film no one was allowed to see, while soldiers died at the front and civilians starved in bombed-out cities. The Nazi Titanic was born out of vanity and perished in censorship, leaving behind a trail of irony that history would never forget. In trying to use art to glorify power, the regime revealed its weakness. The Titanic film was not just propaganda, it was prophecy. What began as a story of British pride sinking into the sea became the perfect metaphor for the fall of the Third Reich itself. The making of the Nazi film Titanic in 1943 remains one of the most revealing examples of how propaganda, ego, and power can destroy not only truth but also the people who serve it. Herbert Salepin, the director chosen for the project, was a man of rare talent and daring spirit. He was known in German cinema for his sharp eye, his command of realism, and his refusal to bow to authority. When Goebbels selected him to direct the most ambitious propaganda film of the war, he saw it as both an opportunity and a trap. From the beginning, the project was wrapped in tension. The Ministry of Propaganda demanded complete ideological control, but Salepin wanted to make art, not a sermon. The studio, located in Berlin's UFA complex, was transformed into a floating illusion of the Titanic's world. Carpenters built lavish cabins, grand staircases, and dining halls while engineers installed moving decks that could simulate the ship's tilt as it sank. The sheer scale of the project was breathtaking. In a country suffering bombings and starvation, Goebbels granted unlimited resources to a fantasy meant to humiliate Britain and glorify Germany. The script turned the historical disaster into a political allegory. It portrayed British financiers and shipowners as corrupt men blinded by greed, forcing the ship to break speed records to boost stock prices. Among them stood a fictional German officer, portrayed as noble, disciplined, and prophetic, the only man wise enough to predict the coming catastrophe. Through him, Nazi ideology sought to contrast German virtue with Western decay. The message was simple: Britain's arrogance caused the Titanic to sink, just as capitalist greed was now leading the Allies toward moral ruin. On paper, the idea served the regime's goals perfectly. In practice, Salepin's perfectionism and contempt for propaganda collided with the rigid expectations of his superiors. He demanded authenticity from everyone on set, using real naval officers as extras to add realism to the evacuation scenes. These officers, however, were arrogant, lazy, and often drunk. Salepin ridiculed them publicly, calling them incompetent and spoiled, comments that quickly reached the wrong ears. Goebbels was infuriated. In wartime Germany, criticizing the military was not merely reckless, it was suicidal. One evening, after yet another argument with his production overseers, Salepin was arrested by the Gestapo. The next morning, studio workers were told that he had hanged himself in his cell. Few believed the official story. His close friend and screenwriter, Walter Zalett-Alphenius, had denounced him to authorities, and his betrayal became one of the darkest stains in German cinema. Salepin's death sent shockwaves through UFA studios. The director who had dared to humanize a propaganda project was gone, silenced in the same way thousands of others were silenced across the Reich. The man who had built the Nazi Titanic would never see it completed. After Salepin's death, Goebbels personally supervised the completion of the film. Editors reassembled the footage under orders to emphasize the moral contrast between British greed and German honor. The final version was a mixture of spectacle and despair. The sinking scenes were stunningly realistic, shot with models and practical effects that rivaled Hollywood's craftsmanship. But the emotional tone of the film was dark and heavy. Instead of inspiring pride, it evoked pity and dread. Audiences who saw private screenings in 1943 left the theaters silent, shaken by the realism of the ship's destruction. For a nation already facing bombings and loss, the film felt like an omen. Goebbels realized his masterpiece of propaganda could backfire. He feared that the public would see in the Titanic's downfall a reflection of Germany's own crumbling empire. The film was briefly shown in occupied territories but never released widely inside Germany. Goebbels ordered it withdrawn, calling it too depressing for a nation at war. The irony was devastating. The regime had spent a fortune to produce a weapon of morale only to bury it in archives. Herbert Salepin's death had been for nothing, and the film that was meant to glorify Nazi values became a symbol of their futility. Decades later, historians would rediscover Titanic as one of the strangest artifacts of Nazi cinema. A film born from arrogance, built on lies, and haunted by the death of its own creator. It showed how propaganda, when pushed beyond truth, consumes itself. The Nazi Titanic never fulfilled its mission at sea or on screen. It ended, like the ship it depicted, surrounded by flames, swallowed by silence, and remembered not for victory but for tragedy. The SS Cap Arcona was launched in 1927 from the Blohm and Voss shipyards in Hamburg, a proud creation of German craftsmanship and ambition. She was one of the finest liners of her time, built to carry wealthy passengers between Hamburg and South America. Her decks gleamed with polished wood, her dining rooms glowed under chandeliers, and her cabins were lined with velvet and brass. She was more than a ship, she was a floating palace, a symbol of prestige and renewal for a nation still recovering from the scars of the First World War. On her voyages to Buenos Aires and back, she carried diplomats, artists, and traders, serving as a reminder that Germany could still build marvels that crossed oceans in elegance and safety. For more than a decade she represented the golden age of transatlantic travel, admired in ports across Europe and South America. When war broke out in 1939, the Cap Arcona's luxury days ended abruptly. Her voyages ceased, her passengers vanished, and her beauty was left to decay in a harbor taken over by the demands of war. For years she remained idle, her once proud hull streaked by rust and her interiors stripped of finery. Yet her fate would change in 1942, when the Nazi propaganda machine sought a ship for their most ambitious cinematic project, the film Titanic. The film required a grand vessel that could mimic the splendor of the British liner, and the Cap Arcona was chosen. She was refitted not for passengers but for cameras, lights, and actors. Her decks became movie sets, her cabins became dressing rooms, and her corridors echoed with shouted directions instead of laughter. For weeks, the ship was transformed into a stage upon which Germany's version of the Titanic tragedy would unfold. Director Herbert Sailpin supervised scenes of panic, lifeboats, and chaos on the Cap Arcona's decks. Sailors, soldiers, and extras were ordered to reenact the fear of the doomed voyage while the Baltic wind howled around them. Explosions were simulated, lights flickered, and actors screamed in choreographed terror. The ship was alive again, but only as an illusion of catastrophe. The irony of filming a disaster aboard a real vessel was not lost on the crew. Some whispered that the Cap Arcona was cursed for playing the role of a ship that sank. Others laughed off the idea, but the shadow of the story lingered long after the cameras stopped. When the film was completed, the Cap Arcona returned to the port of Gotenhafen, stripped of her cinematic glamour. Her role in propaganda was finished, but her role in history was far from over. As the war grew desperate and resources dwindled, the German Navy requisitioned the Cap Arcona for military use. Her luxurious cabins were gutted to make room for barracks, her dining halls filled with supplies, and her decks used to transport soldiers across the Baltic. The ship that once symbolized refinement now carried the machinery of war. She was renamed in naval records as an auxiliary transport, and her engines groaned under the strain of endless movement. Her fate mirrored that of Germany itself, once confident, now exhausted and scarred. The Allies bombed nearby ports, and the Cap Arcona barely escaped destruction several times. Her beauty had vanished, replaced by smoke, oil, and fear. Yet she continued to serve, a relic of another age forced into a conflict that was consuming everything it touched. By early 1945, the Cap Arcona was anchored in the Bay of Lübeck, no longer fit for travel but still afloat. The war was nearly over, and the Reich was collapsing. As Soviet forces advanced from the east, the SS began clearing concentration camps, transferring thousands of prisoners to ships along the coast. The Cap Arcona was chosen to hold them, not as passengers but as captives. Starving and sick prisoners were forced aboard, packed into every corridor and cabin. The once luxurious liner became a floating prison, her elegant past buried under the weight of human suffering. Guards patrolled her decks with rifles, and the screams of the dying replaced the music that once filled her halls. In the dark irony of history, the same ship that had once pretended to sink for a propaganda film was now sailing toward a real and final tragedy. The Cap Arcona had become both symbol and victim of a regime that turned lies into death, and her end was already written in the cold waters of the Baltic. By the beginning of 1945, the German Empire that had once stretched across Europe was crumbling from within. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich had been reduced to rubble and ashes. The Allies closed in from every direction, their bombers lighting up the skies over ruined cities, while Soviet forces swept through the east, crushing what remained of Hitler's armies. The streets of Berlin were filled with refugees and wounded soldiers, and the air smelled of smoke and despair. Chaos ruled over order, and even the most loyal officers began to understand that the end was inevitable. The great ports of northern Germany, once bustling with naval power, became choked with civilians, soldiers, and prisoners, all desperate to escape the advancing Soviet tide. The sea seemed to offer the last illusion of safety, but even the waters of the Baltic would soon turn red with tragedy. In the Bay of Lübeck, the SS Cap Arcona floated quietly, her grandeur long gone. Once a proud ocean liner, she now sat stripped of her elegance, her decks bare and her interiors gutted by war. Her white hull, once polished and radiant, was scarred by years of neglect. She was a relic of a vanished world, a forgotten luxury ship caught in the final convulsions of a dying empire. The German Navy no longer had the resources or purpose to restore her. She existed simply as a hulk, waiting for orders. Around her lay dozens of other ships, some half-sunk, others carrying refugees or troops, all trapped between surrender and annihilation. The atmosphere was one of confusion and desperation, where no one truly knew who commanded whom. In April 1945, as Soviet troops closed in on Hamburg and Lübeck, the SS initiated one of its most sinister operations. Orders were given to evacuate prisoners from concentration camps in northern Germany, allegedly to transfer them to safety ahead of the approaching Red Army. In truth, the plan was far darker. The Nazi leadership intended to erase all evidence of their crimes. Tens of thousands of prisoners from Neuengamme, Stutthof, and other camps were forced on death marches to the coast. Exhausted, starving, and beaten, they stumbled through the mud toward the Baltic, many collapsing and dying on the way. Those who survived the journey were herded into the holds of ships anchored in the bay, including the Cap Arcona. The ship that had once carried wealthy travelers to South America was now filled with the dying remnants of Hitler's victims. Eyewitnesses described the scenes at the dock as hellish. Prisoners were driven aboard at gunpoint, packed so tightly they could barely move. The stench of unwashed bodies and disease filled the air. Many were barefoot, covered in rags, and too weak to stand. Among them were men and women from more than 30 nations: Russians, Poles, French, Norwegians, and Jews from across Europe. Some had survived years of imprisonment, only to find themselves trapped again in the belly of a ship that was never meant to sail. Guards shouted and beat those who resisted, while the SS officers lied to the prisoners, telling them they were being sent to Sweden for medical care and freedom. It was a cruel deception, designed to maintain order while concealing their true fate. As the days passed, the Cap Arcona became a floating tomb. Thousands crowded every deck and corridor, denied food and water, left to suffocate in the filth. The ship's crew, forced into service by the SS, watched helplessly as death spread among the prisoners. The bay itself became a prison, with dozens of vessels carrying similar cargo. No one aboard knew the exact orders, but rumors circulated that the ships were to be scuttled with all prisoners inside once Allied forces reached the area. For the SS, it was the final act of destruction, an attempt to bury their crimes beneath the sea. The Cap Arcona waited in silence as the empire that had built her collapsed around her. In the distance, the thunder of artillery echoed across the horizon, and the once proud flag of the Reich fluttered weakly in the wind. The ship's engines were cold, her lights dim, yet she remained part of a vast machine still capable of cruelty even in its death throes. The world outside was changing, but aboard the Cap Arcona, the horrors of the old world still ruled, preparing for one last unspeakable act before the waters of the Baltic swallowed the final secret of the Nazi Empire. The Cap Arcona floated in the cold waters of the Bay of Lübeck like a ghost from another time. Once a symbol of luxury and pride, she was now transformed into a prison of unimaginable horror. The SS had forced more than 4,500 concentration camp prisoners onto her decks, cramming them into every corridor, cabin, and hold until there was no air left to breathe. The ship reeked of sweat, sickness, and fear. The prisoners came from all across Europe, men and women who had survived years of starvation and torture only to find themselves trapped once again, this time in the belly of a ship that had no destination. They were told they were being evacuated to safety, but none of them believed it. The war was ending, and the prisoners understood the cruelty of their captors too well. They knew that when the Nazis spoke of evacuation, it meant annihilation. On the first night aboard, the temperature dropped below freezing. The prisoners huddled together for warmth, but the cold bit through their rags. There was no food and no water. The SS guards above deck mocked them, occasionally throwing scraps of bread or shouting insults. Those who begged for water were beaten back with rifle butts. Below deck, the air grew unbreathable. The holds were filled far beyond capacity, and the walls dripped with condensation from the exhalations of thousands of lungs. Some tried to rest, but the groaning of the hull and the creaking of the ropes kept them awake. Others prayed softly in different languages: Polish, Russian, French, and Hebrew, each voice blending into a low, desperate murmur that echoed through the darkness. By the second day, death began to move among them. Those too weak to stand collapsed in the corners. The guards refused to remove the bodies, and soon the living were forced to share their space with the dead. Disease spread quickly. The smell became unbearable, a mixture of rot and oil and despair. Above, the SS soldiers stood guard along the railings, their machine guns trained on the decks below. The prisoners knew that any attempt to escape would end in gunfire. Some still clung to the hope that the war would end before the ship sailed, that the approaching Allies would arrive in time to free them. But the SS had no intention of allowing witnesses to survive. Orders circulated quietly among the officers that the ships, the Cap Arcona, the Thielbeck, and the Athon, were to be destroyed with all prisoners aboard once Allied forces drew near. It was the final stage of a plan to erase every trace of the concentration camps before Germany's defeat. In the lower decks, the prisoners began to sense their fate. Survivors later recounted that a strange calm settled over the ship. Many stopped speaking altogether, as if words had lost their meaning. Some scratched messages into the wooden walls, desperate to leave proof of their existence before they vanished forever. Others whispered prayers or songs from home, trying to remember the voices of loved ones. A few clung to small objects they had managed to hide through years of captivity: a coin, a ring, a photograph, symbols of a world that had already been taken from them. The ship became a floating cemetery long before it sank. As days passed, tensions rose between the guards and the crew. The sailors, conscripted into service, realized what the SS intended to do and pleaded for the prisoners' lives, but their protests were met with threats. Some officers, fearing Allied retribution, quietly sabotaged orders or delayed preparations, hoping that liberation would come before the destruction was carried out. Yet the machinery of death remained in motion. The SS had placed armed men on every deck and stationed boats nearby to prevent escape. The Athon, anchored close by, held several hundred more prisoners under the same conditions, while the Thielbeck, smaller but equally overcrowded, mirrored the Cap Arcona's misery. Together they formed a flotilla of death, drifting under grey skies and waiting for the final command. By night, the sound of engines and distant explosions rolled across the bay. The prisoners could see the glow of burning cities on the horizon and hear the thunder of artillery moving closer. They knew the war was ending, but not for them. Every dawn brought new fear that the ship would be scuttled that day. Some prisoners whispered about jumping overboard, but the freezing Baltic waters offered no salvation. Those who attempted it were shot instantly or dragged back aboard, beaten beyond recognition. A few managed to slip notes into the sea inside bottles, messages that would never be found. Inside the ship, hope and madness intertwined. Some prayed for the Allies to arrive, others prayed for death to come quickly. The SS officers walked the decks with an air of fatal resignation, men who no longer fought for victory but for the concealment of guilt. The Cap Arcona became a microcosm of a dying empire: its cruelty, its arrogance, its desperate need to destroy what it could not control. Every plank, every rivet of the ship bore witness to the collapse of morality that had consumed the Reich. When the sun rose on the final days of April 1945, the prisoners sat silently, staring through portholes at the cold water that would soon become their grave. The Allied forces were close, yet salvation felt impossibly far. Some wrote their names on scraps of paper and hid them in their clothes. Others simply closed their eyes and waited. In that moment, the Cap Arcona was no longer a ship but a monument to human suffering, a vessel that carried not passengers but the last breath of a dying world. It floated quietly, surrounded by silence, while beneath its decks, thousands of souls prepared for an end that history would remember only as one of the final horrors of the war. The morning of May 3, 1945, dawned cold and grey over the Bay of Lübeck. The war in Europe was nearly over. Hitler was dead, and the Third Reich was collapsing into chaos. The British Royal Air Force had spent weeks striking German positions across northern Germany to prevent the escape of high-ranking officials and troops trying to flee to Norway or Denmark. On that morning, squadrons of Typhoon fighter bombers took off from their airfields in northern Germany under the command of the 2nd Tactical Air Force. Their mission was straightforward: destroy any German vessels attempting to evacuate soldiers or equipment from the coast. None of the pilots knew that the ships they were about to attack were not carrying troops but thousands of unarmed concentration camp prisoners. As the aircraft approached the Baltic, the bay below looked like a graveyard of ships. The Cap Arcona, still majestic despite her decay, lay anchored beside the Thielbeck and the Athen. From above, they appeared like troop transports ready for departure, guarded by small patrol boats. Smoke from nearby fires hung low over the water, and the pilots, flying fast and low, could not distinguish between combat vessels and civilian transports. The orders were clear: destroy anything flying the German flag. At 2:10 in the afternoon, the first formation dived toward the Cap Arcona. The roar of engines shattered the silence, and within seconds the sky was filled with streaks of fire. Rockets slammed into the hull, exploding with terrifying precision. The first strike tore open the ship's midsection, igniting fuel stores and turning her interior into a furnace. Below deck, panic erupted. Prisoners who had been sitting in the dark were thrown against the walls by the force of the explosions. The sound was deafening, metal screeched, beams snapped, and flames rushed through the corridors faster than anyone could run. Many thought the Germans had decided to sink the ship themselves. Smoke thickened, choking the air, and people stumbled blindly toward any glimmer of light. Those trapped below suffocated or burned where they stood. The wooden partitions that had once divided the ship's cabins now became kindling for the fire that consumed her. On deck, chaos turned to horror as prisoners realized they were under attack from the sky, not the SS. Some tried to wave improvised white flags, tearing off shirts and waving them frantically toward the planes, but the pilots could not see. The second wave of Typhoons swooped in, unleashing more rockets that ripped through the upper decks. Flames rose hundreds of feet into the air, painting the sky with black smoke visible for miles. Within minutes, the Cap Arcona was engulfed in fire. The heat was so intense that paint blistered off the metal, and lifeboats burst into flames before they could be lowered. Prisoners, driven by instinct, leaped into the freezing Baltic water, believing it their only chance. The sea swallowed them, but even there they found no safety. Burning oil spread across the surface, trapping many between the fire above and the icy depths below. Some clung to pieces of wreckage, their bodies blackened by smoke and soot, while others sank silently beneath the waves. From the shore, German guards opened fire on those trying to swim away, mistaking the struggling prisoners for escaping soldiers. The massacre became complete, both in the air and in the water. Nearby, the Thielbeck met the same fate. The bombs struck her with equal force, and the ship capsized within minutes. Hundreds trapped inside were drowned before they could reach the surface. The Athen, slightly apart from the others, was damaged but not destroyed, and her surviving crew managed to rescue a few of the prisoners clinging to debris. In the midst of the burning sea, small boats from nearby ports ventured out under orders from the Kriegsmarine, but most came too late. The fire burned for hours, lighting up the coastline as if the war itself had condensed into one final act of destruction. When the attack ended, the bay was silent except for the crackle of fire and the cries of the dying. The Typhoon pilots returned to base, believing they had destroyed a fleet of fleeing German troops. It was only later that the truth began to emerge. Of the estimated 7,000 prisoners aboard the Cap Arcona and the Thielbeck, barely 500 survived. The rest were burned, shot, or drowned in the cold waters of the Baltic. The survivors, many half-mad from terror and exhaustion, were pulled from the sea by fishermen and Allied patrols in the following hours. Their bodies were covered in oil, their skin blistered, their eyes empty. Some could no longer speak, their voices gone from screaming. In the following days, the shorelines around Lübeck were littered with corpses washed ashore by the tide. Local villagers were forced to bury them in mass graves under the supervision of British soldiers who had by then occupied the area. The Allied command, horrified by the discovery, launched an investigation, but confusion and the chaos of the war's end prevented any immediate reckoning. For the RAF pilots, the revelation was devastating. They had followed orders, yet their mission had become one of the war's most tragic mistakes. The Cap Arcona lay half-submerged in the bay, still smouldering, her twisted metal skeleton jutting out of the water like a monument to the insanity of war. What had once been a symbol of luxury had become a tomb for thousands. The flames that consumed her that afternoon marked not only the end of a ship but the final chapter of a regime that had turned lies into death. The Baltic had become a mirror of the world's guilt, reflecting the last great horror of the war.